Today's topic is one of the most underutilized tools in our arsenal, and that is speaking in tongues as a prayer language. With this teaching today, you will come to the understanding that tongues is legitimate and also how to use it correctly. These are things that it is so mistaught on both areas by those who believe in speaking in tongues and those who don't believe in speaking in tongues. It's mistaught as a whole. Today, we are going to get nitty-gritty and down with it and discuss the proper use of tongues and how to incorporate it into your daily life as it should be. Tongues should be primarily a prayer language. And I'm going to show you this. Back in 2009, this little fella, myself, Tony Myers, walked into a church with his wife. Now, at that time, I was using a walker. Didn't own a Bible, hadn't read scriptures, knew nothing. I walked into this church. During the service, they're speaking this nonsensical stuff, and I'm like, what is going on here? Now, to rub salt in the wound, after the service, here I am in a walker, painfully trying to get to the car. And I'm telling you this from my aspect at the time. Trying to get to the car, this little lady walks up and says, "Can I pray for you?" Now remember, I was an atheist at this time. It was a miracle that I even agreed to walk into a church. Now, my wife was rubbing away my hard edges, and for the first time I was open, yet I met with certain things right away that I'm not understanding, leaving the service already with somewhat of a bad taste in my mouth. On the flip side, the fact that they were all dressed casually and then put on any airs of superiority, now that was a definite plus. There were positive things. But right now, I just want to focus on this so you understand where somebody walking into this situation may never come back. We're here at the church. I'm there with the walker, struggling to get to the car. This woman walks up to me and says, "Can I pray for you?" I shrug and I'm like, "I guess so." She puts her hand on my shoulder, which back in those times, don't touch me. That rubbed me the wrong way right there. If I could have let go of that walker, and once again, I'm speaking of pre-believer Tony, if I wasn't clinging onto the walker for dear life, I would have taken her hand, taken it off of my shoulder. Not only that, I could have, because I had a temper in those days, I may have even hit her. My point being, don't surprise new people like this. The next thing that happened was she started speaking in tongues. At the time, I had no clue what in the world she was doing. When she started speaking, to me, it was gibberish. That was an instant turnoff. You would have seen me backing away from it, and I was ready to get out of there very quickly. So I wanted to paint that picture. This can be a thing that will very much and very easily turn someone off. We don't want to turn people off. That's not our point in church, is it? To turn people off. We want to show them a better path. We want to bring them to the Lord, not shove them away. Well, this is church and people should expect it this way. That's a wrong state of mind. That is a wrong mindset to have. When we come together corporately, it should be for the edification of everyone. That was my experience. And in fact, to put an explanation point on it, it was approximately 8 months before we went to any church, and we actually did go back to that church. The one thing that stood with me was the first person I saw was wearing a bandana. It was because of that we did return back to that church. We have to look at this for the edification of people as a whole. As Paul states, that very same thing. We're going to talk. This is the person now. Okay, fast forward to today. Fast forward to after my healing. After my healing And as I was reading scriptures and studying them for the first time, what happened as a natural result was I just started speaking in tongues. And one day it just started happening. And then that's when I started studying a little bit on it. I'm an advocate for using tongues as a prayer language. It is a means to communicate with God on a very deep level. And I am a full supporter that believers should be doing this every day, constantly, all the time. That's where I stand now. It is one of the most misunderstood and underutilized tools that we have. And if people would take advantage of it in faith, then they will reap the rewards. They will reap the benefits from doing it without striving, without stressing, and it will come more naturally. That is why I'm a huge proponent of speaking in tongues as a private prayer language. So let's get into this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, we have to understand this. He is talking about, it is a discussion about speaking prophetically and speaking in tongues at church, in a congregation. That is what Paul is speaking about. This is for the church body. But yet within 1 Corinthians chapter 14, there is proof that tongues is as it is regularly presented. It is a heavenly language. It is not a language of men. There is a use for, such as in the day of Pentecost, where the apostles were speaking in tongues of men to others. That could be understood, but no one debates that. What they debate is an unknown tongue that people do not understand. Some will say, no, but yet we have gold nuggets all over chapter 14 that will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt this unknown language is a private prayer language and is a legitimate use, and in fact will benefit. I'm going to start off though with Mark 16:17, and these signs shall follow them that what? That believe. They shall speak in new tongues. Okay, key word being new means it's not the tongues of men. That sets it apart right there. Now, let's get into 1 Corinthians 14:2. For one who speaks in a tongue speaks not to men, but to God. For no one understands him, but he utters mysteries in the Spirit. Notice right there, Paul is drawing the distinction that this is not a human language. This is not somebody just speaking a known language. For one who speaks in a tongue speaks not to men, but to God. For no one understands him. Doesn't say for no one except the one it's intended for. No, it says for no one understands him. 14:23. If therefore the whole church comes together and all speak in tongues and outsiders and unbelievers enter, will they not say you are out of your minds? Once again, Paul is referencing an unknown language, not a human language. He would have never said, will they not say you're out of your minds? Even if you don't speak French, right? If I walk up somebody and they're speaking French, well, automatically I know that's their native tongue. I would not think that they were going out of their minds. Or German, or Japanese, or Chinese. It's obvious that's their natural language. So there would be no reason, if tongues were strictly speaking in another known language, there would be no reason for Paul to make that statement. So therefore, Paul is not referencing a known human language. 1 Corinthians 13:1. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. This is specifying two types of men. That's a known language. of angels. 1 Corinthians 14:14. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. If this were simply another human language, Paul would have never stated that the mind was unfruitful. One thing that tongues do is it gets us away from our carnal mind. It bypasses our carnal mind because we're not using our intellect, we're not using our brain. So it bypasses carnal knowledge. 1 Corinthians 14:18. I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you. And once again, he's speaking about in the corporate church. That's what chapter 14 is about, in a corporate setting. Nevertheless, in church, I would rather speak 5 words with my mind in order to instruct others than 10,000 words in a tongue. Once again, he is setting the boundaries. In church, he would much rather get up and only say 5 words with his mind that he understands than 10,000 words in an unknown language. If speaking in tongues was merely another language of men, then we would be using our minds. 1 Corinthians 14:4. The one who speaks in a tongue builds himself up, but the one who prophesies builds up the church. This statement would be completely unnecessary if tongues were only referring to a human language. So throughout all of 14, there are very often indicators that it is indeed a language that is between you and God. Now, I want to take a minute and talk about, there's been quite a few researches done, studies done on speaking in tongues. And one thing they do is, of course, they hook people up to electrodes and wires and all this. People will make the statement that, well, there's many, many religions that speak in tongues. It's all the same. The Holy Spirit isn't involved, etc., etc. Well, I've seen several of these studies, and they have, in fact, done it with Christians. They have done it with Buddhists. They have done it with other people who, quote unquote, to use the Christian form, speaking in tongues. But yet, guess what? With the believer who is a Christian, the frontal lobe that is normally engaged during speech becomes unengaged. Now, when someone from a different religion is speaking in tongues or chanting, it is very active, the frontal lobe. There's a huge difference, which means they're using their mind, which means a Christian who speaks in tongues is using a different source. These other religions that speak in tongues, they are so focused and so concentrated where their frontal lobe lights up like a Christmas tree. I've heard people say, well, you know, other languages use tongues or other religions. And so this is not something specific to Christianity, and it means nothing. According to the studies done, that is wrong. There is a huge difference between speaking in tongues through the Holy Spirit and the chanting or the speaking in tongues in other religions. And one was normally the brain area that is normally used, the frontal lobe in speech isn't used. In the other, it is used more. So there's a huge difference, and this difference can be proven. That argument does not hold water. Now let's get into, I'm going to read some more verses. Let's go 14:2 and 3. For the one who speaks in a strange tongue speaks intimate spiritual mysteries between him and God, but no one else can understand them. 14:4. While speaking in tongues is primarily for personal edification, prophetic instruction inspires the church. I am happy for all of you to speak in tongues, but I desire even more that each of you will also speak revelation knowledge for the benefit of the whole church. So please do not speak in tongues in the church unless you can also interpret what you have just said. So this is where Paul is drawing the line. Paul is saying, look, in the congregation, we are about edifying everyone. That's what church is about, making sure that every person is edified. So limit how often you're speaking in tongues. Make every word. This is 14:9, and this is in the Mirror translation, which I do love, and this is really bringing home what I want to tell you. Make every word count in order to bring maximum benefit to your audience. Weigh your words. Then you will not be wasting your breath. 14:12. Let me make it very clear, while speaking in tongues has its personal benefit, do not make it the thing everybody wants to do. Now, he's talking about in a congregational setting, in the gathering. Then you miss the whole point of spiritual gifts. What is the value if 1,000,000 people can speak in tongues, but they are completely incapable of bringing an inspired word of instruction? Tongues are most certainly not a mark of spirituality. The greater blessing is not in getting the blessing, but in being a blessing to others. And this goes right back to what he makes statement. I would rather say 5 words with understanding than 10,000 words without understanding. This is in the congregational setting. It is better to speak in words that everyone understands, because then everybody gets the benefit. Do not even attempt to speak in tongues in the congregation if you are unable to also unfold and explain the meaning of what was said. Why pray in tongues without understanding? Then there is no point in it. If all you do is speak blessings in tongues, how can anyone else in the same room, especially those who are completely ignorant of spiritual things, feel included and in agreement with what you are saying? There is nothing wrong with your Thanksgiving as such. It is just a pity that you should exclude someone in your immediate audience. Am I speaking against tongues? Not at all. I am so grateful to God that I speak in tongues. I do so perhaps more than all of you. But when we gather together, I would rather speak 5 words with my understanding in order to inspire someone with a mutual renaissance than waste 1,000 words in tongue. That is huge. And so once again, let me go down the very end. 14:39. To conclude, the tongues and prophecy debate. Encourage prophecy with greater enthusiasm than tongues. However, do not forbid tongues altogether. And this is speaking in the church. So Paul is saying, hey, let's keep it reasonable. And this is why, personally, now this is simply my personal opinion, I do not like when the whole congregation speaking in tongues. Once again, this is going against what Paul was teaching, because then somebody walks in and think you're all nuts. There is no benefit in that. Each person is edifying themselves. And Paul makes it, even if one person walks in, because we're not about driving people away and should not be. I want to be very clear on the issue of tongues and its practice in the assembly. If someone insists on speaking in tongues, keep it short. Let it be only 2 or 3 at most. In turn, definitely not all 3 at the same time, and let one interpret what was said. In other words, did Paul think it was cool and hunky-dory for the whole congregation to pray in tongues all at the same time? He's advising against it, not for it. That is why I am a 100% advocator for tongues as a private prayer language. Now, when done in order, tongues can be helpful. When you have one person stand up, speak in tongues, then others interpret, then it does edify everyone. Even then, he says, keep it short. Don't make the whole gathering about speaking in tongues. Take this to the Holy Spirit. Ask Him. Study out 14. And as you see, this is about not the personal life. This is about speaking in tongues in an assembly of people, of Christians. And Paul says, minimize it. Hey, outside the church, speak it all day long. I speak in tongues more than ye all, but within, let there be an order to things. So once again, it is my opinion, based upon 1 Corinthians chapter 14, tongues should be a personal matter of private prayer with God, and then it is very beneficial. It will build you up. And this is the way I encourage it. To me, there are many benefits. Next week, I'm going to talk more about the benefits. This week, I wanted to be focused on one, the proper way. Use it as a private prayer language by any and all means, absolutely. But when it comes to an assembling of the saints, it should be kept to a minimum. Be blessed, be healed, and be a blessing